ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Among the single most valuable items in the world are the Gutenberg Bibles. These were printed in the 1450s in modern-day Germany, and they were the first books printed in Europe using movable type. They announced the age of mass-produced printed books, which accelerated literacy and education and ended up overturning world politics. In the 20th century, the few remaining Gutenberg Bibles began to fetch extraordinary prices in auction houses, but many of them had missing pages. And then in the 1920s, a rare books dealer in the United States named Gabriel Wells managed to procure one of these Bibles, and he began to pull it apart. He took pages from it and sold these pages individually, advertising them as noble fragments. And all this created a monumental scandal at the time. And then, fast forward to 100 years later, an Australian journalist named Michael Visontay stumbled on an old legal document that connected his family to the man who pulled apart the Gutenberg, and Michael discovered how that book had shaped the lives of his parents and grandparents. Michael's book is called Noble Fragments. Hello, Michael.
Hello, Richard.
This story for you starts in the year 2020. Tell me what was going on in your family and your family life at the time.
Well, my mother had recently died, and beginning of 2020, we were under lockdown in the pandemic. So I had a lot of time on my hands, and there were a lot of things to go through after her passing. And I was looking through some old strong boxes that my father had put away. He had already passed away. Just looking for interesting information about the history of the family. And there were lots of sort of yellow parchment type of documents in there. And I was particularly interested in finding information about a woman who had been married to my grandfather. My grandfather had 3 wives, and the middle wife had been erased from the family history. I didn't know where she'd been buried. I hadn't seen any photos of her. I didn't really know anything apart from a name. No one talked about her. So I was hoping that when I went through the boxes that there might be something interesting about her that would shed some light on her. And I did find some travel documents that showed that she travelled with my grandfather from Europe to Australia after the war. So my family comes from Hungary, Hungarian Jews, and Holocaust survivor background. I was able to sort of learn a little bit more about her, and there was a document, a particular legal document, which had her name on it and then had the name of Gabriel Wells. And this was a name that meant nothing to me, but he was from New York, and there's some sort of sense of conflict or dispute in the document.
You must have been massively intrigued by this.
Well, I was beside myself, and I thought, well, who is this guy, and how's he related to my family? So, of course, I started Googling, and the first thing I found was that he had an obituary in the New York Times, and so I was piqued by that. I had been an obituaries editor before, so that meant something extra to me. And it talked about him being a rare book dealer and very prominent, and talked about how he came to America from Hungary before the turn of the century as part of the wave of European immigration. And then I was off. I thought, well, who is this guy? What's he got to do with my family? What about this missing grandmother? And of course, we're under lockdown, so basically it was sort of like a theme park for me to just go off and start making all sorts of inquiries and investigations.
And did this obituary mention that he was the man who pulled apart a Gutenberg?
Yes. So it said that one of the things that he was best known for was the purchase of a Gutenberg Bible, which he broke up and dispersed in individual pages and books, and that he became quite famous for that. It made no judgment about him, but it did say that this was a bedrock for his career, and then went on to talk about other things that he'd done afterwards.
Do you wonder, and at the time did you wonder about this? Because I have a lot of magical thinking when it comes to books. I have a lot of problems tearing out a page out of it, even out of a cheap paperback. I won't fold down the corners of a page, and I've been teased about this in the past. So the idea of like cutting out a page of this impossibly rare book just makes my head spin. Are you like that, or do you not live in this world of magical thinking about
I agree.
books?
I mean, I love reading books in printed form. The idea of having a tear in a book actually just seems wrong and offensive. And the idea that you take a book that was a sort of holy grail of rare books and then decide that you're going to disperse it, break it up, and take this great relic just seemed unbelievable, actually.
Yeah. There's all sorts of reasons why that's a kind of a horrible thing to do, but there are reasons why, and we'll come to this, about how you could actually justify this. But I think the actual act of coming at that book with a razor blade or just tugging at the page or something, I can't imagine myself doing that.
No. Well, it wasn't quite a razor blade, but it was a similar thing. He'd take off the beautiful binding of this book. And the Gutenberg Bible is not just a thin Bible that you see in a hotel room. It was 1,200 pages, and it was so big that it was in 2 volumes because it was actually too big, too heavy to carry. And so what you would do is get someone who works in bookbinding to help you take them apart leaf by leaf and then repackage them. That's an art in itself, and one that's disappearing, but there are still people doing it.
So to follow the family trail to your family's connection to this man and to the Gutenberg Bible, we have to go back to Hungary, where your family is from.
Correct.
As well. Your family, Jewish people, Holocaust survivors, like you say. What were your grandparents doing when war broke out in Central Europe?
So my grandparents, my family, lived in a small town in provincial Hungary, about 100 kilometres from the capital, Budapest. And my grandfather and grandmother ran a delicatessen, an upmarket delicatessen that was sort of like the big general food and merchant store in the town. And my father, who was an only child, he worked in the shop with them to help them when he wasn't at school. And they had quite a reputation there as being the shop to go to.
Now, correct me on my history, but my recall is that Hungary was an ally of Nazi Germany at the outset of the war under Admiral Horthy. And that meant that they didn't have a puppet government to begin with. But then at some point around, it was 44, the Hungarians considered defecting to the Allies instead, and that's when Hitler invaded and installed a puppet government at that time.
That's right? That's right.
And what did that mean for Jewish people once that puppet government was installed?
Well, it was a shock that they couldn't quite understand. People had heard about what was happening in the war because it was 1944 and they'd heard stories about what was happening to Jews in Poland and the general carnage in Europe, but they had felt protected from it. So when the Nazis came in, things happened very quickly. Not in Budapest, where there was a sort of protection order for them not to be deported, but in the provinces, in the small towns, they were basically rounded up within a couple of months and sent into ghettos and were uncomprehending about what was happening, as had many other Jews from other parts of Europe earlier. But because this happened so late and so quickly, it was a nightmare that they just couldn't understand.
So your grandparents, who'd been running this deli, they were sent to the camps. And your father as well. How old was your father at this time?
My father was 14. He was sent off to Auschwitz with his mother, and his father, my grandfather, had been sent off earlier to another camp, Mauthausen. So my grandfather was in one camp, my father and my grandmother were in another. And then they did not see each other again for another year until the end of the war. So this all happened in 1944, and it was a mass deportation of Hungarian Jews.
And out of the three, your grandparents and your father, who survived their time in the camps?
So my grandfather survived and my father survived, but my grandmother did not.
How close did it come for your father in his time in Auschwitz to life and death?
Well, he was at death's door several times. The first time was when he arrived there and was subject to a selection whereby the guards would say, you go one way and you're going to be a labourer, and you go another way and you're going to be put in the gas chamber. So he arrived with his mother, and his mother was supporting a cousin who walked on a caliper. And because of this disability, my grandmother was sent off to the gas chamber with the cousin on the caliper. My father was sent in the other direction. And then there was a selection, and Joseph Mengele, the angel of death, was doing the selection. Nobody really knew what was happening at that point. And he came up and he pinched my father's gut just under the rib cage and could feel the fat because my father was a chubby boy. And I think that saved him because he was considered strong enough to go and work.
Did your dad tell you all these stories after the war, or was this something you found out in the course of your investigations?
Well, I found out a little bit as I was growing up, but it wasn't really till I was an adult that I was able to speak to him about it. It was a thing that couldn't be discussed, as was common in many Holocaust survivor families.
So your grandmother was murdered in the camps, but your father and grandfather survived the war. How did they find each other, do you know, after the war? Because they were sent to separate camps.
Yes. So my grandfather came back to the small town they lived in before my father and actually was able to reopen the delicatessen, amazingly. My father came back and had sent word to him through the Red Cross that he was coming. For some reason that they didn't understand at the time, my grandfather didn't receive the message. So when my father arrived, my grandfather didn't know that he was coming back, didn't know whether he was alive or dead. And when my father met his father, it was a very tearful reunion, and it took several days before my grandfather could bring himself to ask my father about what had happened to his wife.
So his first wife was dead?
Yes.
And that's when he met his second wife, the woman you spoke of earlier that you were intrigued by, who had sort of been almost erased from the family history. This is Olga.
Yes.
How did your grandfather meet Olga, his second wife?
So my grandfather and father were back in their hometown. They had nowhere to live. Their house had been bombed, but they had a shop. So they started looking around for somewhere to live, and there was a woman who had a house and was renting out rooms. And so my grandfather took a room in the house with my father, and the woman renting the room out was Olga. And so they lived there and tried to get their life back together. My father went back to school. My grandfather ran the delicatessen. And bit by bit, they tried to get back to some form of normality. And then my grandfather dropped a bombshell about 8 or 9 months after they'd moved in, and he said to my father that he was lonely and that he was going to marry their landlady.
Do you get the sense that this was, I don't know, two people, shell-shocked people, post-Holocaust people, sort of huddling together for warmth, or was there real love and affection there? Do you have any sense of that?
I think it was something in between. I think it was a practical decision by my grandfather and by Olga, who had lost her husband in the camps, to try and restart their life. My grandfather wanted to have a family unit for his son to grow up in, and Olga didn't want to be alone. She had no children, and she saw a kind man who behaved well towards her. My father saw it very differently, of course. He felt shut out of his own family and resented deeply the intrusion of this woman into the life and intimacy that he had with his own father.
So he didn't accept his stepmother then?
No.
You mentioned there that Olga had had a husband who had died just the same way that your grandfather's first wife had died. Tell me about the connection between those two former spouses of Olga and Pali, your grandfather.
Yes. So my grandfather Pali and Olga's husband were sent off to Auschwitz at the same time, and they were on the same transport, as was not to be unexpected because they're in the same small ghetto in a small town. But when I started researching the story and digging into it, I discovered that they had died at very similar times. And in fact, when we were looking through the Hungarian records that had to be declared after the war so people could actually get on with their lives, somebody had to be declared dead so you could then remarry. Olga's husband and Polly's wife, my grandmother, were one before the other in the deaths of in the registry of deaths in the town. So they were brought together by history.
What did you think when you discovered that connection?
Oh, I couldn't believe it. I thought, well, they happened to be in the same place, but the fact that one was 640 and the other one was 641 on the death registry list was absolutely gobsmacking.
So your grandfather is remarried. He's married Olga. Your father is resentful of this. This is in the immediate post-war years, and Hungary was behind the other side of the Iron Curtain from Western Europe. It now had a communist government. Was that a factor in their decision to want to leave Hungary?
Absolutely. So my grandfather had his delicatessen taken away once by the Nazis, and then as the communists took over, one day an official from the town, a communist, came in and took the delicatessen away again, and so they saw the writing on the wall that there was no future for them. My father, who was 15, decided that he would leave by himself first. It was put to me by him that this was partly practical, easier for one person to get away rather than three. But I also think he was probably keen to get away from his stepmother. And so he went off by himself and went over the mountains into Czechoslovakia. And then my grandfather and Olga, Polly and Olga, then tried later by themselves and got caught, but they were sent back, not penalised, and then they finally got away about a year later, and they all met up in Austria.
So the family's plan was then to go to the United States. What changed? How did they end up coming to Australia instead?
So the plan to go to the US was because Olga was the niece of Gabriel Wells. Gabriel Wells had family, nephews and nieces back in Hungary that he had left when he'd gone over to America, and Olga was his niece, and so she had links to the US.
And did she know that she had links to Gabriel Wells, the famous rare bookseller? Right.
So there had been correspondence, and Gabriel Wells, when he was working in America, would come over to England and the continent every summer, England to go and look for books, and Hungary to see his family. So there was some knowledge of the links of the family.
So there's this prominent citizen who's of the family, who's, I suppose, is willing to sponsor or help sponsor their migration. What went wrong?
Well, amazingly, my father was granted a visa to come and study in America, but his parents were rejected for reasons that weren't entirely clear. And so my father, having left his parents once when he went away without them, decided that he didn't want to be separated from them, particularly his father, again. And so they abandoned the plan to go to America. He didn't want to go by himself. They'd heard from other refugees that Australia was a good place, and they applied. And in those days, people were just going wherever they could. And so they got on a boat from Genoa in 1952, and they came to Australia.
At what point did Olga realise that she had received a windfall from her relative, Gabriel Wells, the New York rare book dealer?
Well, that only happened after the war and after my grandfather had married her, so he was not marrying her for her money. So after the war, Gabriel Wells died. He'd been unwell with a heart condition. And then he had a very complicated will, and it was distributed amongst the nephews and nieces. And Olga got a very modest inheritance from him. And
of how much?
Of about 20,000 American dollars.
In money back then, or in today's money?
In money back then.
Which is still a lot of money. That's got to be a lot of money in today's money. It's got to be several $100,000 in today's money.
Correct. It was several $100,000, and it was enough when they came to Australia to help underwrite the purchase of another delicatessen in King's Cross.
So Olga has now received word she's inherited this money from Gabriel Wells. Let's go back even further again now to the late 19th century when Gabriel Wells came from Hungary as a migrant to the United States. What kind of a man was Gabriel Wells?
Gabriel Wells was a very confident, very intelligent young guy who fancied himself as a bit of an entrepreneur, a risk taker. So he was the first of 9 children. He spoke 8 languages.
Eight languages,
which he learned in Hungary, not including English, and looked set to take over from his father's very prosperous wool merchant business. Married early, seemed to be the golden boy. And then he made a few unwise business decisions, got himself into trouble, and took off without telling his wife and went over to America.
The cad. He was a cad and a bounder, was he?
You'd call him a bit of a bounder these days, yes.
Okay.
The brothers and sisters forgave him, but his wife did not.
No.
He fetched up in Boston in the early 1890s, went to Harvard and fell under the spell of William James, who's the known as the father of modern psychology, really.
Related to Henry James?
The brother of.
His name, Gabriel Wells, was an anglicised version of his original name, Gabriel Weiss.
That's right,
Yeah.
Gabriel Weiss, yes.
Weiss, yes. So he was reinventing himself then in America, as many people did at the time.
And so changing your name was quite common. He made his way down to New York from Boston and was doing a few odd jobs, had not learnt English, but he mastered that very quickly, and then started getting into the books business, where he would attend lectures by a very well-known travel writer who would give these sort of magic lantern shows, which were very popular, sold out every week in New York.
Like primitive slideshows.
Yes. And so Gabriel Wells took these, the collected volumes of these talks, and would repackage them into small books. So he called himself on his passport a reviser, which is a profession that no one had ever heard of before.
But in fact, he was a publisher, I suppose.
Yes, I guess you'd call him that today. And he became very successful at that. And he started turning up at auctions more and more to try and find these volumes from the travel writer, and then started hunting around and started getting a taste for rare books. He was still a minnow, and in that time, in the 1910s and then the 20s, this was the golden age of rare book collecting in America. So there'd been an explosion of incredible wealth in America.
Oil money, railroad money.
Railroad money.
Yeah.
And so these people who had made fantastic wealth wanted to show that they had culture and taste as well as wealth. And the way to do that was to build a library. Buy art, but build a library. Now, they didn't know anything about what books were important or what were valuable, so they would get rare book dealers to be their mentors and their connoisseurs.
They'd buy books by the yard, wouldn't they?
Yes.
And shove it on their bookshelves of these palatial mansions on Long Island.
And they would basically invest all of their faith in the book dealer. And so Gabriel Wells walked into this world, and it was very predatory, because you couldn't just sort of go and get small stuff. You needed to show that you were an alpha male. And so they were all trying to outdo themselves.
Man, he must have done well, though, because even a guy who's managed to do very well as a first-generation migrant, gone to Harvard, arriving in America and going to Harvard, he could somehow afford to procure a Gutenberg Bible. Now, these were worth a ton of money in the 1920s, weren't they?
They were. So at that stage, Gutenberg Bibles had become very popular because they were known to be the first substantial book printed in Western Europe. They were the gateway to democratising knowledge.
The Reformation, all these things happened. It overturned the whole political order when people could read the Bible for the first time in their native language.
Well, that's right, because they could disagree with the clergy. They could have their own ideas. They could spread them. And then very soon after Gutenberg printed his, William Caxton in England imported the printing press to England. Then we had Shakespeare's first folio, and then that was the onset. And so Wells knew about the importance of the Gutenberg Bible because they were being sought after by these very rich Americans. He had got wind from a collector who was a friend of his that there was a Gutenberg that was going up for auction at Sotheby's, and it was an unloved Gutenberg. So there were 45 around at the time, and only 22 of them absolutely pristine. Most of them had flaws, they had pages missing, they'd have bits cut out of them. Some were perfect and they fetched huge prices. But he'd heard about this one in London that had been passed down from one baron to another. And the woman who owned them didn't really care for them much. There'd been some pages cut out, and they thought her children had got it and were playing with it one afternoon. And it was very low down on the list of the Sotheby's auction registry. And it had 53 pages missing. So it wasn't the most perfect Gutenberg Bible. And so the combination of that and the fact that it had some pages missing and that it had been held in the same family for so many years meant that it had escaped the scrutiny of scholars, and people weren't actually sure that it was a real Gutenberg Bible until the auction. And so all of that meant that he was able to get it at a bargain basement price. He paid about a fifth of what the going price was. And that meant that he had a prize Gutenberg Bible. He knew that it would be worth something when he took it back to America. And then he came up with this ingenious plan.
To take the leaves out of it and sell them individually.
Yes. So he announced to the world that it's missing 53 pages. I couldn't possibly sell it intact. which was a lie because there were other Bibles missing more pages that had been sold completely intact. In a very clever marketing plan, he decided to sell them in individual books where they were intact, the book of Genesis, the book of Revelation, the book of Joshua, or individual leaves where that was all that there was. So the Ten Commandments, the Road to Damascus, and so on. And he said he was doing this as a public good to spread the word of the Bible. He was, to be fair, giving some leaves to public institutions that had their own Gutenberg Bibles but were missing a few pages. He gave 3 leaves to the New York Public Library to help improve their Bible. So he did that a little bit. But really, the main game was selling it off. It was an ingenious plan, and it was very successful. So although it was a sacrilege, because the idea of breaking up a Bible, the Gutenberg Bible, which was the Holy Grail, was outrageous to scholars and connoisseurs and to the lofty-minded. But to the rich and famous of New York and Pennsylvania and Boston, where a lot of the old money had been made from the explosion of oil and trains, they thought, wow, this is an opportunity, because they could get their hands on the mystique of the Gutenberg Bible page by page.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Richard Fidler.
So, Gabriel Wells, how well did he do financially out of the sale of these noble fragments, as he called them?
Well, it was a brilliant marketing plan. So when a dealer buys something, even today, and they sell it on behalf of a client, they get a percentage. They get 10%, or if they're lucky, 15%. And that was the going rate in those days, 10%. So when the book dealers would buy a Gutenberg Bible for $50,000, they would get $5,000, and the rest would be paid for and back to the purchaser and the seller. But Gabriel Wells was selling the Bible as a retail event. So he was selling them at $150 a leaf if they were perfect, and $100 a leaf if they were damaged. Now, $100 in those days in America was a month's salary. But he wasn't getting a commission on each of those leaves. He was getting the whole amount. So he made more from the sale of that Bible than book dealers would make from the sale of 5 Bibles.
So it made him a very wealthy man.
Made him a very wealthy man, and it launched his reputation as a risk taker, as a guy that everybody knew because he was selling to so many people. And it became a platform for him entering the top rank of dealers, from which he was able to make many more big gambits in the rare book world.
Gabriel Wells died in 1946, and he died a very, very wealthy man indeed, largely because of the sale of these fragments of the Gutenberg Bible that he pulled apart, as you said. This was happening at the same time your grandfather and his second wife Olga and your father were coming over from Hungary to resettle and start a new life in Australia. At what point did Olga discover that she had been given part of Gabriel Wells' estate, which was quite a very handsome sum at that time?
This would have happened just after the war, just after Gabriel Wells died. He didn't have any children, and so he distributed his estate amongst various nephews and nieces, one living sister, and it took several months. But towards the end of 1946, Olga discovered that she had received this inheritance. And so this changed their outlook. They thought that they could perhaps go to America, but that was denied to them because they were rejected for a visa. And then they heard about Australia, and so that was the moment at which they were able to come out on a ship from Genoa to Australia.
What were they able to do with the money once they arrived in Australia?
Well, my grandfather, who was in his mid-50s, didn't really know how to do anything except run a delicatessen, which he'd done in the old country. And so with the money that they had received from Olga's inheritance, they decided that they would go back to what they knew. And they scouted around and found a shop on Macleay Street, Potts Point, popularly known as King's Cross in Sydney, and bought the business there and reopened a delicatessen.
Like a classic continental deli in King's Cross. Tell me about this deli. And you must have seen it as a kid and spent time in there. What's your memory of this deli and the kind of things that went on in there?
Well, it was the centre of our life. My father was a workaholic. He was working there 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. So we were in there coming and going and with him from the time we were little boys.
This was the Minerva Deli, is that right?
Yes. So
why the Minerva Deli?
So they called it the Minerva Delicatessen because in the 1930s, around the corner in Orwell Street, a new theatre had been built called the Minerva. And so there was a building built on Macleay Street that was in the same style as the Minerva, and it was called the Minerva Building, so they thought they'll call it the Minerva Delicatessen. And the location they chose was absolutely perfect. You had the theatre in Orwell Street, which had since been converted into a cinema. About 30 yards up the road, you had the Roosevelt nightclub, which was owned and run by Abe Saffron, Sydney's crime underworld chief. So there was a lot of foot trade. Around the corner, there was a cafe where the Witch of the Cross, Rosaline Norton, would frequent the cafe and be making obscene drawings on the walls, which got her arrested. So it was a perfect location.
Yeah, that was the heyday of the Cross. It must be said there was a ton of crime going on, but it was a vibrant place in the post-war years.
Very bohemian. In the 50s, particularly before the crime set in the 70s, it was about the only place you could go to eat after 7 o'clock at night. Suburban Sydney was very quiet, so there was a lot of European influences in there.
And eat dangerous food like Hungarian goulash. It was like the one place in Sydney you could get Hungarian goulash was King's Cross in the post-war years. So Fortune had finally smiled on your father and his second wife, Olga, and your father to some degree, even though he wasn't happy about the intrusion of the stepmother on his life. What happened to Olga? What became of her?
So Olga did not have a very happy or very long life. So they came to Australia. She'd made the inheritance. They'd used the money to buy the delicatessen. And then within about 18 months of that, she suffered a stroke and died after a couple of days. And because that had happened so unexpectedly, she didn't have a will. And so under Australian law, her estate went to my grandfather, but her family in America, nieces and nephews and cousins of Gabriel Wells, made a claim on her will on the basis that they had lent her some money after the war to help her and her husband get by, and they were asking for it back. It was very mean-spirited.
Did they need that money?
They did not need that money. They were very well off. They also had inherited money from Gabriel Wells, and I think it is a bit of a taint on them that they came after her for that.
So your poor granddad, he lost his second wife, and now he gets this legal letter demanding how much money are we talking about? Like a serious amount of money in the terms of by the values of the day?
Well, it was probably about half of what she had inherited, and that, of course, was already invested in the shop. So the effect of that was, well, my grandfather didn't have the confidence or the money to fight it in the courts, so he gave in and paid the money back to the American cousins, and that forced my grandfather and father, who were working in the shop, to have to work 7 days a week, 12 hours a day to get back to square one. And my father later said that it took them 5 years to get back to where they had been. So that may have been another reason why Olga was not very well written about in the family history, because she was blamed, I think unfairly, for the misfortune that fell on them after her untimely death.
Yeah, but it was the bequest that got them up and running in the first place.
That's right, yes. So she was central and then became erased.
So your grandfather married again. He lost two wives and he married his third wife. Tell me about his third wife.
Yes, so the delicatessen was where everything happened significant in my family. About a year after Olga had passed away, my father and grandfather were in the shop. A lot of Hungarians and other Jews from Europe would come in because it was known as a continental hub. And one day a woman came in with a strong Hungarian accent with some Hungarian friends of hers. And she'd been told that she might be able to have a conversation with somebody from the old country. And she looked at my grandfather and said that she'd heard that his family was from the same town that she grew up in, and he said yes. And so she asked about what had happened to that family. There were 7 brothers. And he told them that all of them had died. And she said, but what about Polly? What happened to Polly? And he said, well, I'm Polly. And she said, well, I'm Rogie. You don't look like anything the boy that I knew when I was a little girl.
Oh, my God.
And he said, well, who are you? And she said, well, I was your girlfriend when we were teenagers. And he said, I can't recognise you. And then he looked at her closely and he put his hand on his forehead and he said, oh, I don't remember your face, but I do remember that swimming costume that you used to have. So it was not an auspicious reunion. But his third wife, to be...
She overlooked that.
Well, she was very excited.
Yeah.
She had lost her husband just before coming into the shop a few months before. And so that was the beginning of another romance between them. And within a year, my grandfather, who loved to marry quickly, had remarried again and married his third wife.
And who was... She'd almost be a childhood sweetheart if you'd bothered to look up from the bathing suit.
That's exactly right.
What an amazing story.
Yes.
And did they live happily ever after? Please tell me they did. I really hope they did. I feel they deserve this, don't they?
They lived mostly happily ever after, but she was a very willful person and they had a very combustible marriage, but it was mainly happy. A few years after that, something else significant happened in the delicatessen. Another Hungarian woman who knew the family came in, and this time she had eyes on my father, the younger of the 2 men behind the counter, because she was a mother with 2 young daughters and she was looking for somebody for her older daughter who was a little bit shy, very beautiful, but didn't have anybody at the time. And the next thing you know, my father had been introduced to her daughter, also of Hungarian Jewish background. That family had come to Australia before the war, so it was sort of like a picture of what my father could have looked forward to if they had not been caught. My father fell head over heels in love with this woman's daughter. Her name was Eva Buckwell. He spent a whole week's wages on their first date, taking her out to the Chelsea restaurant up the road in Macleay Street, which was the most fashionable restaurant in Sydney. And pretty soon they were engaged. And that became my parents, Ivan and Eva Visontay. All of this happened in the delicatessen.
Once you'd put all those pieces together, that must have been a very satisfying feeling, Michael, because it feels really lovely that we've arrived. Suddenly you're now in the world as a result of all these and a whole lot of historical near misses and a whole lot of comings together and all of that. Did you feel very satisfied to discover all this and put it all together?
It was very enriching. Putting together my family story was a reward in itself, as it is for many people who are seeking to find out about their family background. I'd always felt that my family had given my brother and I a very happy and solid background out of the misery of the Holocaust, and being able to put it in some sort of order meant sort of getting the ledger settled.
In the course of your investigation, you're a man of the written word. You are. You must have taken an inordinate interest in the Gutenberg Bible leaves as they were broken up by Gabriel Wells, who's not related to you by blood, is he? He's not a blood relative of yours.
By marriage.
By marriage, he is, indeed. Did you ever get to see or touch any of the leaves he'd taken from the Gutenberg Bible that he'd pulled apart?
I was fortunate to see many of them. I've seen them in England, I've seen them in France, and I've seen several in Australia. The ones in Australia have been the most frequent and intimate experience, I guess you could say. And for that I was very fortunate because a next-door neighbour of mine, a boy who lived across the street from me, who I happened to get back in touch with, it turned out had become a researcher and cataloguer for a rare book dealer in Melbourne. And this childhood friend of mine became quite central to my research because he told me that I should come and meet his boss, a man called Doug Stewart, who has a big business down in Melbourne. And that Doug was very happy to speak to me, said that he had sold several of these noble fragments and invited me to come and meet him in his offices in Melbourne. And from there I was launched into the world of researching and digging for all of these noble fragments.
Once you saw one of these leaves, what struck you about them?
What struck me was how beautiful they were. So when you look at a noble fragment, a Gutenberg Bible leaf, it is on a parchment or paper, and it is 42 lines. It's known as the 42-line Bible of black print in Latin. So the actual meaning means nothing to me. But the font, the sharpness, the aesthetic integrity of the page is inescapable. You think back to 1455, there's no discolouring, there's no smudge. A lot of the leaves have beautiful, what they call rubricated or coloured capital letters to make them look more beautiful. Some of them have illustrations in the margins of events that were written about on the pages. So they're very exciting to look at.
So even though they're designed to be mass-produced, it still has the aesthetic of an illuminated manuscript to some degree. In other words, you put something, if you're putting the Word of God on the page, it must sing, it must be beautiful, it must be kind of perfect.
Well, the beauty of this was that it looked as good as something written by hand, a manuscript. And there have been exhibitions where the library would take a page written by hand and a page printed on a printing press and put one on top of each other so that the visitor could see that the printing press was as good as something written by hand. And so that's a testament, in particular with the Gutenberg Bible, to the quality that Gutenberg was able to bring to his printing press.
When you have an object as valuable and as holy and as praised and as beautiful as that, it tends to attract the interest of all kinds of unsavoury types. I mean, robber barons in the United States. Tell me about the Ukrainian politician who'd managed to get hold of one of these leaves.
Yes, so whilst I was digging around to find out what had happened to these leaves as they've been sold around the world, my research had taken me to Scandinavia, to Central America, to Asia. I happened to see a small story about a politician in the Ukraine in 2011, I think it was. The Ukrainian government had asked all of its politicians to declare their assets. And so this politician came out, and he was a pro-Russian politician, very controversial.
This is Viktor Medvedevchuk, who was, as you say, a pro-Putin Ukrainian politician. So he'd purchased one of these leaves?
Well, he announced out of the blue after this audit of the politician's assets that he had purchased a noble fragment for the glory of Ukraine. And he held a press conference, and it attracted media from around the world. Scholars and librarians were scratching their heads. Where did it come from? How did we know it was authentic? He took great offence at the fact that journalists questioned his integrity and the truth of what he was saying as though it was the gospel.
Right.
And
so what happened then after Russia invaded Ukraine in
2022? Well, they never were able to find out how he got it. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Medvedevchuk, whose daughter had been blessed by Putin, Putin was her godfather, he was arrested as a sort of fifth column.
By Zelensky's people, right?
Correct. And all of his assets seized, and he had 10 cars and 5 apartments and a whole lot of other property. They couldn't find the noble fragment leaf, and nobody knew what had happened to it. And Medvedevchuk was then sent back to Russia in a prisoner swap, and he was the sort of leading asset in the prisoner swap. And then that was the end of that trail of looking for the noble fragment from him. He turned up again in Russia and started writing propaganda for Putin and is alive and well there, but nobody knows what happened to the leaf. However, as a result of that research, I was sent on a trail to find out who was the last known owner of that leaf. And that took me to the United States, to a Christian collector who lived in Indianapolis. So, of course, it comes as no surprise that Christians would be interested in collecting a Gutenberg Bible. But the story of how this collector, who owned the Ukrainian leaf, then became an aficionado of noble fragments was gobsmacking. So he told me that he had been sitting at a gospel concert in Indianapolis in what was called the world's largest cafeteria, a cafeteria that had been opened by a friend of his who wanted to recreate his own childhood, where after going to church, his family would take him to a cafeteria and they could eat everything they wanted. And so his childhood dream was to rebuild a cafeteria and hold Christian gospel concerts in it. And so in 1989, when communism was coming down, this collector was sitting in the cafeteria listening to a gospel concert. And at the intermission, the head of the World Bible Society came out and said to the crowd, "Communism is ending. The wall is going to come down. We have an offer for you. We have King George Bibles here, and if you give us $500, we will give you each a leaf of that Bible, and that money will go to sending Bibles to the godless Soviet Union to help them find inspiration through God and Jesus Christ." And so this collector handed over his $500. He was the son of a preacher, so the idea appealed to him. But after doing that, it occurred to him that possibly he could start collecting Bibles. It had never occurred to him before, so he started collecting English Bibles, the Coverdale Bible, the Tyndale Bible, the King George Bible, and this led him on a path to the Gutenberg Bible. And so he told me that over the years he bought and sold up to 20 of these leaves, of these noble fragments, and he loved them. He thought that they were beautiful. He loved the essay that had been written to accompany the marketing of the noble fragments, because they were put in their own individual bindings and leather covers. And he waxed lyrical about them, and he thought that this was a great thing to do. So over the years he bought up to 20, traded them. He kept one at the end, framed up on the wall of his office, which he looked at and went to read every day that he went into his office. So one trail would lead to another. I then learned about the whole industry of buying and selling Bibles, which is a massive industry in the United States. This was part of the joy of the research of the book. I got in touch with collectors, with archivists, with dealers, with academics, with ordinary people who would buy and sell them. And they were all on the other side of the world. And I would be up in the middle of the night on my phone, on Zoom, on Skype. And in the morning, I would race into the bedroom and when I'd got up and say to my wife, "You won't believe what I've heard, what I've learned about this." And she would go, "Oh, that's wonderful, because it was a torrent of uncovering.
One of your big aims when you went out on this journey to begin with was to find Olga as well. Olga, your grandfather's second wife, who had been erased from the family records. Did you find her? Where is she now?
Well, it took many years. I learnt quite a lot about her through the researching for the book. I discovered where she was buried. She was buried in a different cemetery from the rest of my family, and so I was able to visit her grave. And the grave reflected the story that I had understood about her. The grave was very bare. It was a very brief inscription to my dear wife, but not signed by my grandfather or by my father. They didn't really want to own her in the grave. And so that reflected, I think, the unhappy ending that she had had to her life. I learned a bit more about her relations with the American family and with the Hungarian family. But I guess what was important was that she became a flesh and blood person. I was able to uncover a letter that she had sent to one of her relatives congratulating him on the birth of a child, and so that was the only voice that we actually found of her. So she went from being somebody who'd been hidden away to being someone who had played a very important, if camouflaged, role in the family history, but I got to know her as a person.
And in the history of Sydney as well.
Well, yes, because her role was pivotal in the delicatessen being opened and our family flourishing and becoming a very important part of King's Cross culture.
Michael, what a great story. Thank you very much for sharing it.
It's been a pleasure, Richard.
Michael Visontay's book is called Noble Fragments. Today's conversation was produced on the lands of the Gadigal people. The producer was Rebecca McLaren. Executive producer is Nicola Harrison. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.